They called themselves the Desert Vipers, the most feared motorcycle gang to ever stalk the lonely highways of northern Nevada. For months, they'd been leaving a trail of broken spirits and shattered windows across every roadside stop on Highway 95 until they rumbled into Cooper's all-night diner and crossed paths with Marcus Deadeye Wilson. To them, he was just another gray-haired veteran sipping black coffee at the counter, an easy mark for their entertainment. But when they ridiculed his weathered Colt and dared him to prove his worth, they never imagined they were challenging the most lethal gunslinger ever to serve in the Special Forces. The late autumn wind howled across the Nevada desert, sending tumbleweeds dancing across Highway 95 like ghostly messengers in the pre-dawn darkness. Cooper's all-night diner stood as a beacon of warmth against the desolate landscape, its neon sign casting a soft blue glow across the empty parking lot. Inside, the aroma of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon carried the promise of comfort to weary travelers and local regulars alike. Marcus Wilson occupied his usual spot at the counter, the same seat he'd claimed every morning for the past 15 years since retiring from a life few people could imagine. His calloused hands, scarred from decades of handling weapons in places whose names never appeared on public maps, wrapped around his coffee cup with familiar ease. The Colt at his hip, secured in a custom leather holster that had seen more action than most military units, rested like a faithful companion against his leg. Sarah Cooper, who'd inherited the diner from her uncle 5 years ago, glanced nervously at the highway through the streaked windows. The morning crowd had grown sparse lately, ever since the Desert Vipers had started claiming Highway 95 as their territory. Even the long-haul truckers, usually as reliable as the sunrise, had begun taking alternate routes to avoid the gang's growing reputation for violence. "More coffee, Mr. Wilson?" Sarah's voice carried a tremor she couldn't quite hide. The diner's fluorescent lights reflected off the silver in his hair, highlighting a face that bore the quiet dignity of a man who'd seen more than his share of the world's darker corners. "Appreciate it, Sarah," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the gravelly warmth of aged whiskey. His steel-grey eyes, still sharp despite his 70 years, scanned the nearly empty diner with the automatic vigilance of someone who'd spent a lifetime watching for threats. Only Jack Chen, the local high school physics teacher, sat at the far end of the counter, his breakfast growing cold as he kept one eye on the highway. "Third morning this week," Jack observed, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're getting more confident, showing up earlier and earlier." The distant rumble of motorcycles grew steadily louder, like approaching thunder on a cloudless day. Sheriff Diana Martinez entered, her uniform crisp despite the early hour. She nodded to Marcus before settling onto a stool near Jack. "Morning, folks," she said, accepting a steaming cup from Sarah. "I assume you've heard about what happened at the Henderson travel stop?" Marcus wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, the titanium ring on his right hand catching the fluorescent light, a reminder of operations so classified even their existence was denied. "Pete mentioned something yesterday. Vandalism?" "That's putting it mildly," the sheriff sighed, running a hand through her short dark hair. "Broke every window in the place, emptied the register, left one of their snake tags spray-painted across the front. Fourth business this month. First it was the Johnson truck stop," Jack added, pushing away his untouched eggs. "Then the Williams place, now this. They're working their way up Highway 95, marking their territory like actual vipers." The rumble of motorcycles grew louder. Through the diner's windows, they watched as 8 riders from the Desert Vipers pulled into Cooper's parking lot, their chrome and leather glinting menacingly in the growing dawn light. Their patches showed a coiled snake preparing to strike, its fangs dripping venom against a blood-red sun, a sight that had become all too familiar along this stretch of highway. "Marcus," Sarah called softly, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the coffee pot. Maybe you should better start some fresh coffee, Sarah, he interrupted gently, his voice carrying the same calm it had shown during countless operations in places where a single wrong move meant death. Seems we're about to have company. The bell above the door chimed as the first 3 riders entered, their boots heavy on the worn linoleum. The leader, a tall man they called Sidewinder, surveyed the diner with calculated menace. His eyes settled on Marcus, noting the old man's worn holster with obvious amusement. Marcus continued sipping his coffee, seemingly unperturbed by their presence, but Sarah noticed how his right hand rested slightly closer to his hip. A gesture so subtle most wouldn't catch it. The sheriff's jaw tightened, but she remained seated, acutely aware that any wrong move could spark something none of them wanted to face. The morning sun was just beginning to paint the horizon, in shades of amber and gold, but inside Cooper's all-night diner, a different kind of dawn was about to break, one that would remind everyone why some legends never truly retire, and why some skills, like Marcus Deadeye Wilson's legendary marksmanship, only grow sharper with age. The morning sun cast long shadows across Highway 95 as it cut through the heart of northern Nevada, the asphalt shimmering like a dark river through the desert landscape. Cooper's all-night diner stood as an oasis for travelers and locals alike, its weathered sign swaying gently in the crisp autumn breeze that swept across the sprawling desert plains. For 30 years, Marcus Wilson had started his mornings the same way, arriving precisely at first light, settling into his spot at the counter, and savoring Sarah's coffee while watching the world wake up through the diner's wide windows. His battered Stetson hung on the rack by the door, and the leather holster at his hip had grown smooth from years of wear, a remnant from his days as the deadliest shot in Special Forces Delta Unit. Sarah Cooper wiped down the counter with practiced efficiency, stealing concerned glances at the highway. Her uncle had taught her everything about running a diner, but nothing had prepared her for the shadow that had fallen over their community in recent months. "More coffee, Mr. Wilson," she called out, though his cup was still half full. The morning. Regulars had grown sparse lately, ever since the Desert Vipers had started claiming Highway 95 as their hunting ground. "Thank you, Sarah," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that hadn't faded with age. His eyes, still sharp despite his 70 years, scanned the nearly empty diner. "Seems awful quiet this morning." Jack Chen pushed his cooling breakfast around his plate, his usual enthusiasm for teaching dampened by the growing tension. "4th morning this week," he observed, his voice low. "They're getting bolder, riding through earlier and earlier. My students are scared to walk to school alone now." As if summoned by his words, the distant rumble of motorcycles grew steadily louder, like approaching thunder on a clear day. Sheriff Diana Martinez adjusted her gun belt, her movements carrying the weight of someone trying to maintain order in an increasingly chaotic situation. "Had a call from Carson City this morning," she said, accepting fresh coffee from Sarah. "The Vipers hit another place just south of there. They're expanding their territory." Marcus wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, the titanium ring on. His right finger, a memento from an operation in Kandahar that would remain classified for 50 years. Catching the morning light. "Tell me about Carson City," he said, his voice carrying the same calm it had shown during countless high-stakes operations. "Gas station on the outskirts," Diana replied, her face tight with concern. "Owner tried to stand up to them. He's in intensive care now. They're escalating, Marcus. It's not just vandalism anymore." Through the diner's windows, they watched as more Desert Vipers pulled into the parking lot, their chrome and leather glinting menacingly in the growing dawn. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she set fresh coffee cups on the counter, but her voice remained steady. The bell above the door chimed as the first riders entered, bringing with them the smell of leather and gasoline. Jack Chen watched with obvious unease as more bikers filed in, their patches displaying the coiled viper that had become a symbol of fear along Highway 95. He'd seen how their presence had affected his students, attendance dropping, grades slipping, the light of curiosity dimming in young eyes that had seen too much violence too soon. Marcus continued sipping his coffee, his movements unhurried but purposeful. Those who knew him, who'd heard whispered stories of his time in Delta Force, recognized the subtle shifts in his posture, the way his right hand rested closer to his hip, how his eyes tracked each new arrival with calculated precision. He'd spent decades in places where the difference between life and death was measured in fractions of seconds, and those instincts never truly faded. Sarah moved behind the counter with careful efficiency, her movements carrying the weight of someone, trying to maintain normalcy in an increasingly dangerous situation. Her uncle had owned this diner when Marcus first started coming in, fresh from his last deployment. She'd grown up hearing stories about the quiet veteran who could hit a quarter from 100 yards and had more confirmed kills than any other operator in Delta Force history. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the diner's floor. In the distance, more motorcycles could be heard approaching. The Desert Vipers were about to learn that some legends never fade, and some skills, like Marcus Wilson's legendary marksmanship, only grew more precise with age. Sheriff Martinez watched the scene unfold with growing concern. As much as she respected Marcus's abilities, even at 70, the situation was becoming increasingly volatile. The Desert Vipers had been systematically taking control of every establishment along their stretch of highway, using intimidation and violence to establish their dominance. Her hand rested near her service weapon, but she knew that drawing it would only escalate things beyond the point of no return. Through the diner's wide windows, the Nevada desert stretched endlessly, its rugged beauty a stark contrast to the tension building within Cooper's walls. The morning light painted the mountain ranges in shades of purple and gold, but inside, shadows seemed to deepen as more vipers crowded into the space, their presence transforming the once comfortable diner into an arena where old-world values were about to clash with modern-day brutality. "Well, well," Sidewinder's voice carried artificial warmth as he approached Marcus's spot at the counter. "What do we have here? Didn't know they still made cowboys like you, old-timer. Thought they were all in museums by now." The other bikers chuckled, spreading out through the diner with practiced intimidation. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she set fresh coffee cups on the counter, but her voice remained steady. "What can I get you, gentlemen?" "Oh, we're not here for coffee," Sidewinder replied, his eyes never leaving Marcus, "just admiring the local color. That's quite a piece you're wearing, Grandpa. Family heirloom." The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the diner's floor. In the distance, more motorcycles could be heard approaching. Marcus's weathered hands remained steady around his coffee cup as Sidewinder circled his position, the biker's shadow falling across the worn counter like a gathering storm. "You didn't answer my question, old-timer," Sidewinder pressed, his voice carrying the edge of someone used to immediate compliance. "That antique on your hip just for show, or do you actually remember how to use it?" Jack Chen watched from his spot at the counter, his knuckles white around his coffee cup. He'd only been teaching physics at Silver Creek High School for 3 years, but he'd heard the stories about Marcus Wilson. The older residents spoke of him in hushed tones, tales of his legendary accuracy mixing with documented fact until it was hard to separate truth from legend. "Some things," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the same quiet dignity it had for the 30 years he'd been coming to Cooper's, "a man doesn't forget, like respect and manners." He lifted his cup to his lips, the morning light catching the titanium ring on his finger, a ring that marked achievements most of the town's younger residents had never heard about. Sarah Cooper moved with careful efficiency behind the counter, her movements carrying the weight of someone trying to maintain normalcy in an increasingly dangerous situation. Her uncle had owned this diner when Marcus was still actively serving, tracking high-value targets across terrains most people couldn't find on a map. She'd seen firsthand what he could do with that worn Colt 1911. Respect? Sidewinder's laugh carried no humor. Times change, Gramps. Highway 95 runs on different rules now, Viper rules. He leaned closer, his leather cut creaking. And rule number 1 is understanding who's in charge. Sheriff Martinez watched the exchange with growing concern, as much as she respected Marcus's abilities. Even at 70, the situation was becoming increasingly volatile. The Desert Vipers had been systematically taking control of every establishment along their stretch of highway, using intimidation and violence to establish their dominance. "Diana," Marcus addressed the sheriff without taking his eyes off Sidewinder. "How's Melissa doing with her shooting practice? Heard she qualified top of her class at the academy." The seemingly casual question carried weight that only the diner's regular patrons understood. Melissa Martinez, the sheriff's daughter, had learned marksmanship from Marcus Wilson himself, on the same range where he'd once trained Delta Force operators in the art of precision shooting. Those sessions had stopped years ago, or so most. "People thought, she's doing fine, Marcus," the sheriff replied carefully, using the practiced tone of someone who understood the weight of each word. "Using those techniques you taught her, just like you said." Sidewinder's face darkened at being ignored. He moved to knock Marcus's coffee cup aside, but before his hand could connect, the old veteran's fingers closed around his wrist. The grip, belying Thomas's age, was like iron. "Son," Marcus said quietly, "that coffee's still hot. Be a shame if anyone got burned." The other bikers tensed, hands moving toward concealed weapons. But Sidewinder, looking into Marcus's eyes, saw something that made him pause. There was no fear there, no uncertainty, just the calm assessment of a man who'd faced far worse than motorcycle gangs in places whose names never appeared in history books. Through the window, more Desert Vipers could be seen arriving there, bikes filling Cooper's parking lot. The morning sun glinted off chrome and leather, casting serpentine shadows across the pavement. Jack Chen thought about his students, how the gang's presence had changed their lives. Parents were keeping their children closer to home, local businesses were closing earlier, and the vibrant community life that had defined Silver Creek was slowly being strangled by fear. "You know what I see?" Sidewinder recovered his composure, jerking his hand away from Marcus's grip. "I see a relic, a leftover from times that don't exist anymore. This isn't some war zone, old man. Your kind is extinct." Marcus took another sip of his coffee, his movements unhurried. "Might be right about that," he conceded. "World's changed plenty since my day, but some things stay the same." His eyes met Sidewinder's. Like the difference between seeming dangerous and being dangerous, the implied challenge hung in the air like smoke. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she set a fresh pot of coffee on the burner, the familiar aroma mixing with the tension that filled the diner. Outside, more Desert Vipers gathered, drawn by some instinctive sense that something significant was unfolding. "Tell me something," Marcus continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent diner. "Those snakes on your patches, did you earn them or just buy them? Because real Vipers, they know better than to mistake quiet for weakness." The morning sun had climbed higher, its light catching the worn grip of Marcus's Colt. The weapon wasn't just a relic of his past. It was a symbol of everything the Desert Vipers thought they'd erased from Highway 95. Dignity, respect, and the quiet strength of men who didn't need to prove their power through intimidation. Sidewinder's face darkened at Marcus's words, his artificial composure cracking to reveal something uglier underneath. The other Desert Vipers shifted positions in the diner, their movements carrying predatory intent as they sensed their leader's growing anger. "You want to know about earning things, old man?" Sidewinder's voice dropped dangerously. "How about I show you what we've earned? Boys, give our friend here a demonstration of Viper hospitality." Before anyone could move, Marcus's voice cut through, the tension like a steel blade. "Sheriff might want to step outside with Jack and Sarah. Things are about to get educational in here." Despite the situation, his tone remained conversational, almost pleasant, but those who knew him recognized something in his bearing, a subtle shift from retired veteran to something else entirely. "Mr. Wilson," Jack began, concern evident in his voice, but Marcus's slight smile stopped him. It wasn't the smile of a man in danger, it was the smile of a teacher about to deliver an important lesson. "Now, Jack," he said softly, "some lessons need to be witnessed from a safe distance." Through the diner's windows, more desert vipers could be seen arriving, their bikes filling the parking lot and spilling onto Highway 95. The morning sun caught their chrome and leather, creating a menacing display of power. Inside, sidewinders. Men had spread out, confident in their numerical superiority. "Last chance, cowboy," Sidewinder sneered. "Take off that gun belt, lay it on the counter, and maybe we just rough you up a little. Keep it on, and we'll make an example of you that Highway 95 won't forget." Marcus carefully set his coffee cup down, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "Funny thing about examples," he mused. "They work both ways. Been watching you boys work your way down this highway, spreading fear, thinking it makes you strong. Might be time for folks to see what real strength looks like." "Boss," one of the younger vipers called out, holding up a smartphone, his face showing confused recognition. "Been looking up our friend here, Marcus Deadeye Wilson. There's classified files about him from back in the day. They used to call him the Ghost of Delta Force. Sheriff Martinez finished from near the door, back when he was running counter-terrorism operations. 23 confirmed eliminations, 47 successful extractions, and not a single civilian casualty. They said he could disarm a target so fast the bullet was still in the chamber when the gun hit the ground." Sidewinder laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it now. "That was, 40 years ago? Look at him. He can barely hold his coffee cup steady." "Age is funny that way," Marcus replied, standing slowly. "Makes some things harder, sure. But others," his right hand rested casually near his holster, "just get smoother with practice, like judgment, timing, knowing when a situation calls for speed and when it calls for wisdom." The tension in the diner had shifted. The younger vipers still projected menace, but the older ones, those who'd served in the military themselves, showed signs of uncertainty. "Think I read about you," one of them said slowly. "Weren't you the one who took down the Al-Qaeda cell? In Kandahar, 3 terrorists with suicide vests, and you dropped them all without detonating a single explosive." "That was a lifetime ago," Marcus acknowledged. "Back when men who wanted to prove themselves did it face to face, not by terrorizing. Folks just trying to live their lives." Sidewinder, sensing his control of the situation slipping, moved suddenly. His hand dropped to his waistband, reaching for concealed steel, but before his fingers could close around his weapon, a sound split the air. A whisper of well-oiled leather, a click of aged metal, and suddenly Marcus Wilson's Colt seemed to materialize in his hand. The movement had been so smooth, so blindingly fast, that several witnesses would later swear the gun had simply appeared. Even Sidewinder, his own weapon only halfway drawn, froze in astonishment. "Now then," Marcus said quietly, his aim unwavering despite his age, "seems like a good time to discuss the future of Highway 95 and how it might look different from what you boys had planned." The morning sun streamed through Cooper's windows, illuminating a scene that would soon become legend in its own right. An old warrior standing against modern-day outlaws, proving that some skills never fade, and some traditions never die. But what the Desert Vipers couldn't know was that this moment wasn't just about one man's stand. It was about to become a turning point that would transform the entire region, starting with a demonstration of speed and skill that would remind everyone why Marcus Wilson had earned the name Deadeye in the first place. The diner had fallen into complete silence, broken only by the idle rumble of motorcycles outside. Sidewinder stood frozen, his hand still hovering over his half-drawn weapon as he processed the impossible speed he'd just witnessed from a man old enough to be his grandfather. "That was your first mistake," Marcus said calmly, his Colt remaining steady, assuming that because something's old, it's weak. Second mistake was thinking fear equals strength. His steel-grey eyes swept the room, taking in each Desert Viper with the measured assessment of a man who'd spent decades reading similar situations. Third mistake is coming up, trying to decide if you can still win this. Jack Chen watched. From near the door, his earlier fear replaced by amazement. In the 3 years he'd known Marcus Wilson, he'd seen only the quiet veteran who occasionally visited his classroom to teach students about desert survival and navigation. Now he understood why his older students' parents spoke of him with such reverence. "You can't watch this whole highway forever, old man," Sidewinder found his voice, though it carried less conviction than before. "We've got chapters in 3 states. This is just one diner on one stretch of road." "Interesting thing about highways," Marcus replied, his tone conversational despite the tension. "They connect more than just places. They connect people, stories, legends." He shifted slightly, and somehow his stance became even more commanding. "Been making some connections of my own lately." Sheriff Martinez understood the implication before the others. She'd seen Marcus at the Veterans Association meetings, had noticed the quiet conversations with men who still carried badges, and others who'd traded them for civilian jobs but hadn't lost their skills. "Got a call yesterday," Marcus continued, "from an old friend down in Reno. Seems the Desert Vipers tried setting up there too, tried the same intimidation tactics on another relic, retired Navy SEAL named Commander Richards. You boys might want to look him up, see how that worked. Out for your brothers." Recognition flickered across some of the older Vipers' faces. The Reno chapter's sudden disappearance 2 months ago had been a mystery, but now pieces were falling into place. Sarah Cooper moved carefully behind the counter, her movements deliberate as she reached for the old phone that hung on the wall. Like everyone else who'd grown up in the area, she knew the stories about the informal network of retired operators who still kept watch over Nevada's highways. "That's right, Sarah," Marcus nodded, reading her intention. "Might want to make that a call we discussed. Let folks know it's time." Sidewinder's composure cracked further. "Time for what, old man? Your senior citizen patrol?" "Time to remind everyone that some traditions don't die," Marcus replied. "That some men don't stop being who they are just because the world changes around them. Each of those businesses your chapter's been terrorizing, they're not just victims. They're links in a chain that runs deeper and stronger than you boys can imagine." Through the diner's windows, more dust could be seen rising on Highway 95, but these weren't motorcycles approaching. They were pickup trucks, SUVs, and the distinctive profile of police cruisers from 3 counties. "See, while you boys were building your little empire through fear," Marcus continued, his voice carrying decades of earned authority, "I've been making calls, talking to old friends, men who haven't forgotten what these highways mean, what they represent. Real Vipers. Don't just mark territory, they protect it." One of the younger Vipers moved suddenly, perhaps hoping to take advantage of Marcus's divided attention. The old man's response was so smooth, so blindingly fast, that even those watching closely couldn't follow the movement. Somehow, without seeming to shift position, Marcus had drawn a second Colt covering both sides of the diner. "That's another mistake to add to the list," he said quietly. "Thinking speed is just for the young. What you boys don't understand is that true speed, the kind that matters, comes from something deeper than muscle. It comes from knowing, deep in your bones, exactly what you're capable of, and exactly what you stand for. The approaching. Vehicles were close enough now that their details became clear. They carried men that some of the older Desert Vipers recognized. Former Special Forces, retired SEALs, Marine Force recon operators who'd never quite hung up their skills. Men who, like Marcus Wilson, had spent decades protecting these highways. And the communities they connected. Last chance, boys, Marcus offered, his guns unwavering. Way I see it, you've got two choices. You can be smart, lay down your weapons and learn about respect the easy way. Or, his smile carried no humor, you can be like your Reno brothers and learn about it the hard way. Either way, Highway 95 is about to remember what real law looks like. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting stark shadows across the diner's floor. In those shadows, the Desert Vipers were about to learn that some legends don't fade with time. They just wait for the right moment to remind everyone why they became legends in the first place. The tension in Cooper's diner crystallized as the convoy of vehicles pulled into the parking lot, surrounding the Desert Vipers' motorcycles. Through the windows, Marcus Wilson's words were proving prophetic as familiar faces emerged, men carrying themselves with the unmistakable bearing of long-time operators. "Let me tell you what's really happening here," Marcus continued, his Colts steady as heartbeats. "Right now, Commander Richards is leading a similar group in Reno. Captain Martinez has another in Las Vegas. Remember the Al-Qaeda cell I mentioned? Martinez is the one who taught me about dual-wielding these Colts. He's 78 now, but his hands are still steady enough to sign death warrants or offer second chances." Sidewinder's face contorted with a mixture of rage and dawning comprehension. His carefully constructed image of power was crumbling, replaced by the realization that he'd unknowingly challenged something far older and more organized than he'd imagined. "That's impossible," he snarled, but his voice carried the hollow ring of someone watching their world unravel. "You're bluffing. No way you old-timers could organize something like this." Marcus's laugh carried genuine amusement. "Son, we were organizing counter-terror operations while you were still learning to ride with training wheels. These highways, they're not just roads. They're lifelines connecting communities, families, traditions. Every diner, every gas station, every small town, they're all part of something bigger, something you boys tried to break." Outside, more vehicles arrived. Jack Chen recognized some of the men emerging from them, fathers of his students, retired operators who now worked as security consultants or ranch hands, men who, like Marcus, carried themselves with the quiet confidence of those who'd spent their lives standing against chaos. "Know what your real mistake was?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested it wasn't really a question. "Thinking that because we retired, we stopped being who we are. Thinking that because we chose quiet lives, we forgot how to be dangerous." Sarah. Cooper moved carefully behind the counter, her hands steady now as she poured coffee for the men filing into the diner. Each newcomer took up positions with practiced efficiency, their movements suggesting years of tactical experience. "Richard sends his regards," a weathered man in his 70s announced, his voice carrying the gravel of too many desert operations. "Says to tell you the Reno chapter of the Desert Vipers sends their apologies. All 19 of them, from jail." Sidewinder's remaining bravado crumbled. "You're crazy, old man, all of you. This isn't some war zone anymore. You can't just—" "Can't what?" Marcus cut him off. "Can't protect our own. Can't stand together against men who mistake cruelty for strength." His smile carried decades of earned confidence. "Way I see it, you boys have been writing checks your courage can't cash, thinking nobody would stand against you. Time to learn about real courage." Sheriff Martinez moved with professional authority, coordinating with the newly arrived reinforcements. The Desert Vipers found themselves facing not just Marcus Wilson's legendary speed, but a carefully orchestrated response from men who'd spent their lives dealing with threats to their communities. "Here's what happens next," Marcus announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the diner. "You boys are going to lay down your weapons, slowly and carefully. Then you're going to learn about something your kind never understood. The difference between taking and earning respect." One of the younger Vipers, panic overriding judgment, made a sudden move for his concealed weapon. Marcus's response was so smooth, so blindingly fast, that even those watching closely couldn't follow the movement. The young man's gun went spinning across the floor, his wrist caught in a grip that belied the old operator's age. "That speed," Marcus said quietly, "isn't just about quick draws anymore. It's about choosing, faster than thought, between stopping a threat and offering redemption. Your choice now is simple: face charges for everything you've done along Highway 95, or help us clean up the mess you've made." The morning sun streamed through Cooper's windows, illuminating a scene that marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The Desert Vipers' attempt to rule through fear had collided with something they couldn't intimidate or overwhelm: the unbreakable bonds of men who'd spent their lives protecting these highways and the communities they connected. Outside, more vehicles arrived, carrying the weight of law and tradition. The Desert Vipers were about to learn that some forces can't be broken by modern methods, some strengths don't fade with age, and some legends don't just tell stories. They remind everyone why they became legends in the first place. The breaking point had arrived, not just for the Desert Vipers, but for every outlaw group that had mistaken these quiet highways for easy territory. Marcus Wilson's stand wasn't just about one diner or one stretch of road. It was about to become a turning point that would remind everyone why the old ways and the old guardians had never really gone away. The next few moments in Cooper's diner unfolded with the precise choreography of men who'd spent lifetimes handling similar situations. Marcus Wilson kept his Colts trained on strategic points, while retired operators moved through the diner with practiced efficiency, disarming Desert Vipers and securing weapons. "Had an interesting conversation last week," Marcus said conversationally, his aim never wavering despite his apparent casualness. "Seems your chapter's been busy up in Carson City too. Interesting thing about Carson City, they've got their own relic up there. Man named James Blackhawk, retired Force Recon. Your boys thought he'd be an easy target." Sidewinder's face showed recognition, then concern. The Carson City operation had gone silent 3 days ago, with no explanation from their brothers there. "Blackhawk," Marcus continued, "he's got this interesting philosophy about young Vipers who don't know their place. Says sometimes they need to be taught by the old eagles who marked the territory first." Sheriff Martinez coordinated with the arriving reinforcements, her movements carrying the weight of official authority backed by decades of experience. "Got word from State Police," she announced. "They're moving on Desert Viper chapters in 3 counties. Seems our friends here have quite a record: extortion, vandalism, assault. List keeps growing." The younger Vipers looked increasingly uncertain, their bravado crumbling as they realized the true scope of what they'd stumbled into. This wasn't just about one old operator in one diner. It was about an entire network of men they'd dismissed as relics, men who'd never stopped protecting their communities. "You know what real power is, son?" Marcus addressed Sidewinder directly, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "It's not about how loud your bikes are or how many people you can frighten. It's about the quiet strength of men who stand together, who remember what these highways mean, what they represent." Sarah Cooper moved behind the counter with renewed confidence, serving coffee to the gathered operators. Her hands no longer trembled. The fear that had gripped Cooper's diner for months was dissolving in the presence of real strength. "Your father," Marcus continued, his eyes fixed on Sidewinder. "He served in Iraq, didn't he? 3rd Infantry Division. Hard man, tough job. Bet he taught you about respect, about earning your place. Somewhere along the way, you forgot those lessons. Started thinking fear was the same as strength. The mention of his father hit Sidewinder like a physical blow. His face showed a flicker of something beyond anger or fear, perhaps the first glimpse of recognition, of understanding how far he'd strayed from the values he'd been raised with. Jack Chen watched from near the door, grading papers forgotten, in his hands as he witnessed what would surely become local legend. His students' parents had told stories about the old guardians of Highway 95, but seeing them in action, seeing how their quiet strength could overcome modern threats, was something else entirely. Got another call coming in, one of the retired operators announced, his phone displaying messages from across the region. Chapters falling in 3 states. Seems our friends here didn't realize how many relics were watching, waiting, remembering what real law looks like. Marcus's stance shifted slightly, though his aim remained perfect. Time to make a choice, boys. Way I see it, you've got 2 paths ahead. One leads through every courthouse in 3 states, facing charges that'll keep you riding prison yards instead of highways. The path, he paused, his voice carrying a hint of hope. That one's harder, but it leads somewhere better. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting stark shadows across Cooper's floor. In those shadows, the desert vipers faced a moment of truth, not just about their immediate future, but about the very nature of strength and respect. Your bikes, Marcus continued, they're not just machines. They're freedom, power, brotherhood. But you boys twisted that, turned something noble into something ugly. Question is, are you ready to remember what real brotherhood looks like? Outside, more vehicles arrived, not just law enforcement now, but ranchers, business owners, community leaders who'd suffered under the Desert Viper's reign of terror. They came not for revenge, but to witness the moment when their highways would be reclaimed by men who understood the true meaning of protection. Last chance, Marcus announced, his voice carrying the finality of judgment. Choose your path. Show these highways whether you're vipers or just snakes playing at being dangerous. The moment stretched like wire under tension, ready to either snap or reshape itself into something new. Highway 95, and all the communities it connected, waited to see which path the Desert Vipers would choose, and what that choice would mean for the future of their shared roads and shared destiny. The diner's phone rang, cutting through the tension like a steel blade. Sarah Cooper answered it, her voice steady as she handed it to Marcus Wilson. Without lowering either Colt, he activated the speakerphone, letting everyone hear the graveled voice that emerged. Deadeye, it's Blackhawk up in Carson City. Got your message. Networks activated. Every retired operator from here to Las Vegas is either on the road or coordinating with local authorities. Just like Fallujah in '04, brother. Marcus's slight smile carried decades of shared history. Just like Fallujah, James. Remember what you told me then about snakes and eagles? Blackhawk's laugh carried through the speaker. Old eagles might get gray, but their talons stay sharp. My boys have already rounded up the Carson City chapter. Seems these young vipers forgot that real predators protect their territory, not just mark it. Sidewinder's face showed growing comprehension as he realized the true extent of what his gang had stumbled into. This wasn't just about one old operator or one diner. It was about an entire network of men who'd never stopped watching, never stopped protecting their communities. Got Commander Richards on the other line, Blackhawk continued. Says Reno's secure. Martinez has Las Vegas locked down. The old network never died, Deadeye. Just went quiet, waiting for the right moment. Jack Chen watched in amazement as more vehicles arrived outside Cooper's diner, each carrying men who moved with the unmistakable bearing of experienced operators, some retired, some still active, all responding to a call that transcended official channels. Tell them about Baghdad, one of the older Desert Vipers spoke up suddenly, surprising everyone. My uncle was there. Told me stories about how a handful of Delta operators stood against 50 insurgents. Said there was one man. They called him Deadeye. That's ancient history, Marcus cut in, though his eyes showed appreciation for the recognition. Today's about writing new history, about showing these highways what real protection looks like. Sheriff Martinez coordinated with the arriving reinforcements, her radio crackling with updates from across 3 states. The Desert Vipers' carefully constructed empire was crumbling, not under the assault of rival gangs or federal authorities, but under the coordinated response of men they dismissed as relics. Networks reporting activity all along Highway 95, a retired operator announced, checking his phone. Every chapter's being contained, sons and grandsons of old operators joining in, making their own legacy. This isn't just about stopping them anymore, it's about showing them a better way. Marcus kept his Colt steady, but his voice carried a teacher's patience. You boys thought you were building something, thought fear and intimidation could give you control. But real control, real respect, that comes from protecting, not threatening, from standing together, not standing over others. Sarah Cooper served fresh coffee to the gathering of operators, her movements carrying new confidence. Through the diner's windows, more dust clouds approached, not just law enforcement now, but regular citizens, community members, drawn by word of what was unfolding. Running Bear, Marcus spoke into the phone. Remember what you used to say about redemption, about how even the youngest eagle can learn new ways. Still believe it, Deadeye? Question is, do these young ones want to learn? Do they want to understand what real strength looks like? The morning sun cast long shadows across Cooper's floor as Marcus Wilson faced the Desert Vipers, his stance unwavering despite his age. This moment wasn't just about ending their reign of terror, it was about offering them a choice, a chance to understand the true meaning of the power they'd misused. Network standing by, Blackhawk's voice carried authority even through the speaker. Every old guardian from here to the state line is ready. Just like the old days when we kept these highways safe, not through fear, but through something stronger. Outside, the gathering of vehicles and men had transformed Cooper's parking lot into a demonstration of quiet strength. These weren't just retired operators responding to a threat. They were guardians, awakening to remind everyone that some traditions never die, some bonds never break, and some men never stop protecting what matters. The Desert Vipers faced a moment of truth, surrounded by men who'd spent lifetimes understanding the difference between seeming dangerous and being truly strong. The network that had awakened wasn't just about enforcement, it was about transformation, about showing younger generations that real power comes from protection, not intimidation. The morning air in Cooper's diner crackled with tension as Sidewinder faced the moment that would define not just his future, but the future of every desert. Viper present. Marcus Wilson's Colts remained unwavering, but his eyes carried something beyond threat, an offer of understanding, of potential redemption. Your father, Marcus said quietly, addressing Sidewinder with unexpected gentleness, served with Charlie Company, 3rd Infantry. Michael Reynolds, tough man, honest soldier, used to stop here every morning before his deployment briefings, back when my hands were steadier and his were still strong. The mention of his father's name hit Sidewinder like a physical blow. His carefully constructed facade of menace cracked further, revealing glimpses of the man he might have been before the Desert Vipers. How did you... Because those of us who watched these highways, we knew everyone's story, every soldier, every family, every dream these roads carried. Marcus's voice took on a teacher's patience. Your father wanted more for you than this. Saved every dime he could for your college fund. What happened to that dream, son? Through the diner's windows, more vehicles arrived, but now they carried familiar faces, local ranchers, business owners, community leaders who'd suffered under the Desert Vipers' reign. They came not seeking revenge, but drawn by the possibility of witnessing transformation. Networks reporting similar situations across the region, Sheriff Martinez announced, checking her radio. Desert vipers everywhere facing the same choice. Continue down a path of destruction, or remember who they were before the patches and violence. Jack Chen watched from his position near the door, understanding dawning in his eyes. This wasn't just about ending the Desert Viper's control. It was about offering them a way back to something better, something real. Got word from Commander Richards, one of the retired operators, called out, "Reno chapters already turning, young riders there remembering their own fathers, their own forgotten dreams. Some are breaking down, asking for a chance to make things right." Marcus's aim remained steady, but his voice carried decades of earned wisdom. That's what these highways have always been about. Not just connecting places, but connecting lives, giving people chances to choose better paths, to remember who they really are. Sarah Cooper moved behind the counter, pulling out an old photograph she'd kept tucked away. A younger sidewinder in his high school graduation gown, smiling with his father's arm around his shoulders. She placed it carefully on the counter. "Another piece of the bridge home. Your mother still works at the VA hospital," Marcus continued, his words striking deeper than any bullet could. "Night shift nurse, just like always. Keeps your photo in her locker, not the one with the patches and anger, but the one from your basic training graduation, the one where you still knew how to smile without threatening." Sidewinder's hands, those hands meant for something better than violence, began to tremble. Around him, other Desert Vipers showed similar signs of internal struggle, as if awakening from a long, dark dream. "Network standing by," Blackhawk's voice came through the speaker, carrying ancient understanding. "But this isn't about overwhelming force anymore. It's about choosing, about remembering that even the fiercest predator can find its way home." Outside, the gathering had transformed Cooper's parking lot into something remarkable. Law enforcement. Vehicles stood alongside ranch trucks and family cars. Their drivers united not just against the Desert Vipers, but for something larger, the possibility of redemption. "Got a call from your old drill sergeant last week," Marcus revealed, his words carefully chosen. "Remember Sergeant Phillips? Still talks about the recruit who never quit, who understood that real strength wasn't about dominating others, but about mastering yourself." The morning sun painted long shadows across the diner's floor, but they seemed less menacing now, more like bridges between what was and what could be. The Desert Vipers faced not just physical surrender, but a deeper choice, a chance to rediscover the men they were meant to be. "Time to choose, boys," Marcus announced, his voice carrying finality without threat. "Not just about today, but about every tomorrow that follows. These highways can be paths of fear, or they can be roads back to something better, something real." The moment stretched like dawn, breaking over the Nevada horizon, full of possibility, of potential transformation. In Cooper's diner, surrounded by men who'd never forgotten the true meaning of strength, the Desert Vipers faced their moment of truth. Their choice would echo not just through their own lives, but through every community their highways connected. The first crack in the Desert Vipers' unified front came from an unexpected source. A younger member, barely in his 20s, stepped forward slowly, his hands raised in a gesture that carried more than simple surrender. "My grandfather," he said, voice shaking slightly, "he was Special Forces out of Fort Bragg. Used to tell me stories about men like you, Mr. Wilson, about what these roads meant, what they stood for." He reached up slowly, deliberately, and removed his Desert Viper's patch. "I forgot those stories somewhere along the way, forgot who I was supposed to be." Marcus Wilson's aim remained steady, but his eyes showed understanding. "What's your name, son?" "David. David Thompson. Grandfather was Master Sergeant James Thompson. Jim Thompson." Marcus nodded, recognition warming his voice. "Good man, solid operator. Saved my team's lives once outside of Kandahar. Bet he never told you that story." Other Desert Vipers shifted uncomfortably. watching their youngest member break ranks, but in his action, they saw something that spoke to buried memories, to forgotten promises and abandoned dreams. Networks reporting similar movements across the region, Sheriff Martinez announced quietly. Young riders remembering their roots, their family legacies. Reno chapters almost completely surrendered, many asking about making amends. Sidewinder watched his carefully built empire crumbling, not through force, but through something more powerful. The awakening of conscience, the remembrance of better paths. Your father, Marcus continued, addressing Sidewinder directly. He didn't just serve in Iraq. He was a field medic too, spent his weekends teaching first aid at the community center. Wonder what he'd think about what his son's been building out here on Highway 95. Sarah Cooper moved with quiet purpose behind the counter, setting out more coffee cups. Each cup represented more than refreshment. It was an offer of return, of community, of belonging to something real. "Got word from Black Hawk," one of the retired operators called out. "Carson City chapter's turning too. Seems when young vipers remember their true pack, their false pack loses its hold." Through Cooper's windows, more vehicles arrived, but now they carried different passengers. Parents, teachers, community leaders who'd watched their young men disappear into the Desert Viper's shadow. They came not seeking vengeance, but carrying hope for restoration. "Remember your first bike?" Marcus asked Sidewinder, his voice carrying memories. "That old Honda your father helped you rebuild. Spent every weekend for a year working on it together. Wasn't about power then, was it? Wasn't about frightening people or marking territory. It was about freedom, about family, about earning something real." Jack Chen watched the transformation unfolding before him, understanding dawning in his teacher's heart. This wasn't just about ending the Desert Viper's reign. It was about reclaiming lost sons, about showing them the way back to who they were meant to be. Another Viper stepped forward, then another. Like a dam breaking, the carefully constructed facade of menace began to crumble, each man facing not just surrender to authority, but surrender to truth, to the reality of who they'd been before the patches and violence. Networks got rehabilitation. "Programs ready?" Black Hawk's voice came through the speaker. "Not just about punishment, about restoration, about helping these young ones find their way back to the right path." The morning sun had climbed higher, its light seeming to wash away shadows, both physical and spiritual. In that light, the Desert Vipers faced not just the consequences of their actions, but the possibility of redemption. "Last summer," Marcus said quietly, his words carrying to every corner of the diner, "your mother came in here, Sidewinder, sat right where you're standing now, talked about the little boy who wanted to join the Marines, who dreamed of serving like his father. That dream's still there, son, just buried under all these false ideas about power and respect." The transformation continued, not with the thunder of violence, but with the quiet power of truth. Each Desert Viper faced not just Marcus Wilson's legendary speed, but his deeper wisdom, his understanding that real strength lies not in breaking things, but in rebuilding them. "Choice is yours now," Marcus announced, his voice carrying no threat, only opportunity. "These highways can be roads to redemption or paths to prison. The network stands ready not just to enforce, but to help rebuild, to show you what real brotherhood looks like." The moment stretched like a Nevada highway at sunset, full of possibility, of potential transformation. In Cooper's diner, surrounded by men who'd never forgotten the true meaning of strength, the Desert Vipers faced not just surrender, but salvation. Their choice would echo not just through their own lives, but through every community their highways connected. Sidewinder stood motionless, his world crumbling around him as more of his men laid down their patches. His eyes locked onto the old coffee cup at his usual spot, the one his father had used years ago, the one Sarah Cooper still kept waiting, holding on to hope for the boy who'd once been part of this community. "Your father's hands," Marcus continued, his Colt steady but his voice gentle. They were always stained with iodine. Honest work, he called it. Said a man's hands tell his story. What story are your hands telling now, son? Sidewinder looked down at his own hands, adorned with rings meant to intimidate, calloused not from honest labor but from violence. Something shifted in his expression, like ice breaking on a winter river. Networks reporting from Las Vegas, Sheriff Martinez announced, quietly. Commander Martinez says they're getting calls from Desert Viper families, parents, siblings, all asking about second chances, about ways back home. The morning sun streamed through Cooper's windows, catching the silver in Marcus's hair and the worn leather of his holsters. Those watching saw not just an old operator with fast hands, but a bridge between what was and what could be. Remember your senior year? Marcus asked, his words carrying memories Sidewinder had tried to bury. Marine Corps, JROTC. Your dad worked double shifts to buy you that dress uniform, said his boy was going to make something of himself. Still can, you know. Sarah Cooper moved behind the counter, pulling out an old photograph she'd kept tucked. Away, a younger Sidewinder in his dress blues, smiling with his father's arm around his shoulders. She placed it carefully on the counter, another piece of the bridge home. Got something else to show you, one of the retired operators called out, holding up his phone. Your father's outside. Been there since we called him. Waiting to see if his son remembers who he really is. Sidewinder, no, Michael Reynolds now, the name his father had given him, stood frozen between his past and his future. The torn patch in his hand seemed to weigh heavier with each passing moment. Networks reporting similar reunions across the region, Sheriff Martinez said softly. Fathers and sons finding their way back to each other, old wounds beginning to heal. Marcus watched the scene unfold, his stance unwavering but his voice gentle. Your father's hands, he observed, still carry the same strength they did when you were learning at his side. Same strength that could guide a scalpel or comfort a scared boy after a nightmare. Sarah Cooper moved quietly behind the counter, pulling out old photographs she'd kept safe through the years, snapshots of happier times, of a young Michael learning his father's values, of dreams not yet lost. To fear and false power. Got word from Commander Richards, one of the retired operators announced. Reno chapter's transformation is spreading, sons returning to family businesses, picking up tools instead of trouble. Communities responding with open arms. Through Cooper's windows, more families arrived, not just law enforcement and old guardians, but parents who'd never stopped hoping, never stopped praying for their children's return. Remember that first aid class we took together? Michael Reynolds Sr. asked, taking another step forward. You were 12. Couldn't reach half the supplies, but you wouldn't give up. That determination's still there, son. Just been aimed in the wrong direction. Jack Chen watched the scene with a teacher's understanding. In his classroom, he'd seen how young lives could change course, how lost paths could be rediscovered through guidance and grace. Networks got programs ready. Blackhawk's voice carried hope. Not just about paying debts, about rebuilding lives, about remembering that even the fiercest predator needs a true pack, a real purpose. The transformation continued. Not with the thunder of motorcycles, but with the quiet power of truth. Each Desert Viper faced not just surrender, but the possibility of reclaiming their abandoned dreams. Choice is still yours, Marcus said, his aim unwavering but his voice carrying a father's patience. But remember, real strength isn't about how many people fear you. It's about how many people you protect, how many lives you make better. The moment stretched like a Nevada horizon, endless with possibility. In Cooper's diner, surrounded by men who'd never forgotten the true meaning of strength, Michael Reynolds faced not just the end of his Desert Vipers chapter, but the beginning of a new story. His choice would echo not just through Highway 95, but through every life his actions had touched, every dream his violence had shattered, and every path to redemption now opening before him. with movements that seemed to carry the weight of years. Michael slowly reached up and gripped his desert viper's patch. The sound of tearing leather cut through the diner's silence as he pulled it free, leaving a darker square on his vest where fear and power had once resided. "My father," Michael's voice cracked, sounding younger suddenly, more like the boy who'd dreamed of serving. "He really comes here every morning." "1 a.m. sharp," Sarah Cooper answered softly, pulling out a worn coffee cup with Reynolds written on the bottom. Same cup, same seat, same prayers for his son. Through Cooper's windows, a figure became visible. A man in medical scrubs, standing among the gathered crowd. Michael Reynolds Sr.'s weathered face carried neither judgment nor condemnation, only the patient hope of a father waiting for his son's return. Networks reporting similar scenes across 3 states, Sheriff Martinez announced, her voice carrying quiet satisfaction. Families reuniting, sons coming home, bridges being rebuilt. Marcus Wilson's Colts remained steady, but his eyes showed understanding of the transformation unfolding before him. For the first time since the standoff began, he slowly lowered his weapons, recognizing that the battle had been won not with bullets, but with something far more powerful. The awakening of buried truths and forgotten dreams. The morning sun painted long shadows across Highway 95 as Cooper's Diner became the epicenter of a transformation that would spread across Nevada. What had started as one old operator's stand against fear had become something more. A reminder that real strength isn't found in causing fear, but in having the courage to change, to rebuild, to come home. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the power of redemption, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We've got more tales of courage, transformation, and the unbreakable bonds between fathers and sons coming your way. Don't forget to hit that notification bell, because tomorrow we've saved something extra special just for you. 7 a.m. sharp, Sarah Cooper answered softly, pulling out a worn coffee cup with Reynolds written on the bottom. Same cup, same seat, same prayers for his son. Through Cooper's windows, a figure became visible. A man in medical scrubs, standing among the gathered crowd. Michael Reynolds Sr.'s weathered face carried neither judgment nor condemnation, only the patient hope of a father waiting for his son's return. Networks reporting similar scenes across 3 states, Sheriff Martinez announced, her voice carrying quiet satisfaction. Families reuniting, sons coming home, bridges being rebuilt. Marcus Wilson's Colts remained steady, but his eyes showed understanding of the transformation unfolding before him. "Your father taught you about healing," he said softly. "Said every wound can either break or strengthen, depends on how it's treated, and the heart behind the treatment." More desert vipers followed their leader's example, patches falling like autumn leaves. Each torn piece of leather represented not just surrender but awakening, a return to forgotten truths and abandoned dreams. Michael took one step toward his father, then another. The torn patch fell from his trembling fingers, landing on Cooper's floor like a discarded mask. The morning sun painted the Nevada desert in shades of gold, but inside the diner, a different kind of dawn was breaking. The transformation that began that morning in Cooper's Diner spread like wildfire across Highway 95 and beyond. The Desert Vipers didn't just disband, they transformed. Under the guidance of men like Marcus Wilson and the network of veteran operators, former gang members found their way back to the dreams they'd abandoned, the values they'd forgotten, and the families who'd never stopped waiting for them. 1 year later, Cooper's Diner still stands as a beacon along Highway 95. But now it's known for something more than just good coffee and warm meals. It's become a symbol of redemption, a reminder that it's never too late to choose a different path, to remember who you were meant to be. Marcus Wilson still takes his morning coffee at the counter, But now he's often joined by Michael Reynolds and other former Vipers who found their way home. They're not just reformed gang members. They're community leaders, mentors, living proof that real strength comes not from causing fear, but from having the courage to change. If you found yourself moved by this story of redemption and second chances, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Every week we bring you powerful tales of transformation, courage, and the unbreakable bonds that connect communities. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next upload. Some stories, like the old guardians of Highway 95, are too important to be forgotten. Remember, real legends aren't just about the past, they're about lighting the way forward for generations to come. See you in our next video, where more extraordinary stories await.